Thanks for coming, and thanks for the walk from the other side of the world, it seems, to come back here. So appreciate you taking the time. I'm Norman Judah. I'm the Chief Technology Officer for Microsoft Services. And what we want to do for the next hour in what we've called this foundation session around the cloud is take you from the point that you were at earlier, which was 10,000 feet or 100,000 feet up in the cloud, and bring you down to varying levels of granularity and start to get much more real about what's possible in the cloud today. And we'll take both the IT pro aspect of it, and we'll also take the developer view of it, and really try and give you this broader perspective about what you can do today, as well as some of the things that are going to come in the future. So what I'd like to do quickly is just set some context on that to give you an idea of where we are. But as the prelude, we're going to have 4 demos. That's what we're going to do today. The first one's going to be building a private cloud. You saw an early view of some of those pieces, but we're going to go much deeper on some of the system center pieces that are there. We're then going to go into building some event-based applications. We'll have a couple of announcements about some things we're going to do there. Look at SharePoint as an application platform, and then do a burst out between SharePoint and Azure-based data. And then we'll finish up by taking an application that you're running on-premise today that's kind of complex and got different code types. And we're going to take that application and show you how you can redeploy that application into the cloud. So these are going to come in sequence. But before we get there, I want to do a little bit of a setup. If I can actually get my remote control to work. There you go. Let's start off with this, which is, this is a press release that we wrote back in March of this year. And the press release is actually dated in March of 2015, and it's about an application that's running in 2015, highly available. It's a global bank. It runs in multiple languages, uses different kind of I/O types. But what's important to think about, if this is the press release that we're going to be publishing in about 4 years from now, if this application has been in production and has been able to demonstrate these various attributes, guess what? You have to be building that today. You need to be building out that infrastructure today, and we need to be building this application today in order to meet the goals that are stated in this application. And so part of what's happening with the cloud today is a lot of people are looking at it and trying to understand it, whether it's a private cloud on-premise or a public cloud or some hybrid mode, is we need to think about what we need to be doing today. Because 2015, it turns out, not that far away. And so trying to get in touch with that, I think, is actually pretty important. I'm a strong believer in the history and going back and looking at history. And this is a particular slide that we showed probably last year or the year before that looked at these various waves of technology. I'm not going to go through them, but what I did is go back and think, what, in these various waves that occurred, what did that mean for skill sets and for people, whether you're an IT professional inside of a company, or you're in a services organization, or an ISV, or a partner? What does that mean from a skill sets perspective? So if you go back to that client-server generation, what happened then that were dramatic changes? Well, there were a couple of things. One, Visual Basic. Visual Basic 1.0 came out in that time frame, and Visual Basic essentially allowed millions of people to build really bad user interfaces quickly. Building a good user interface is incredibly hard, but it did open up the possibility of people, different kinds of people with different skill sets, starting to understand what it takes to build graphical user interfaces. The other thing that happened in that time frame was Active Directory and Exchange. The deployments of Active Directory, the design of directory topologies, the redesign of directory topologies that failed, and a lot of work around that basic concept. But from a distortion, from a skill set perspective, or discontinuity, that's kind of what happened in that time frame. If we then go to the internet, some interesting things happened there. The first one from a developer perspective was internet applications, HTML applications, starting to integrate into databases. It became ASP.NET, PHP, that whole environment of applications. But although that was different skills, it wasn't a distortion in terms of what people were doing. If you're an application developer, you actually move from one application type to another. And the discontinuity wasn't terribly dramatic. The dramatic change that happened in terms of the disruption in that time was this thing called SharePoint. Because SharePoint popped up, and suddenly SharePoint was the answer. It was the answer for portals, it was the answer for application platforms, document storage, search, compliance, and a whole series of things. But suddenly they became this massive demand of SharePoint skill sets and SharePoint applications, whether you were a breadth developer or whether you were a boutique developer doing a narrow vertical like financial services or whatever it is inside of SharePoint. But that in itself was a massive, massive distortion. So then if we come to the cloud, there's the question of what is the distortions that are going to happen in this cloud time frame? What are the things that is going to occur in this time frame that are going to be different from a skill set perspective? And what we'll try and show you today is if you're a .NET developer today, congratulations, you're a .NET developer for the cloud because it's just learning about a different platform, but the skill sets and the tooling is pretty similar. I think the biggest impact in this area is going to be around the infrastructure and deploying of infrastructures and the understanding of infrastructures, as well as the depth of the infrastructure that's being made available, whether that's being done on-premise or whether that's being done in a private cloud. So I think that's going to be the fundamental change that will happen here. What is interesting looking back on this is that in reality, it's always on this 10 or 15-year cycle. And so the one thing that we do know is in 10 or 15 years, we'll all be sitting probably in the same chairs in the same room, a little grayer, having the same discussion about the next generation. But the things that are coming are not going, that pace is going to continue, and it's going to continue dramatically. To me, the biggest change that we're going under right now is this fundamental change from software into services, from writing software into writing services, and thinking about your application as to how you write services or, frankly, how you consume services. I was talking to the folks in the Exchange team recently, and the team that developed Exchange 2007 and went to Exchange 2010. The 2010 is quite a complicated product that deals with massive scalings of millions of users. It deals with multi-tenancy. But there were about 800 developers who took Exchange from 2007 to 2010. I then went to the BPOS team and I said to them, so how many people do you have working on the infrastructure that's taking that Exchange product and actually making it available broadly as a service, which then includes the provisioning, the commerce engines, the support engines, and so on. Turns out the BPOS team has about 1,200 engineers working on that problem. And so it actually is pretty complicated taking stuff that was written as software and then moving that into a service. In fact, it gets more interesting when you look particularly at servers and what it takes to take a server from being a product into a service, and how you deal simplistically with stuff like provisioning, versioning, multi-tenancy, connection, scaling, elasticity, and those elements. There's quite a lot that goes on inside of the server at that time. So part of what we see happening then is this changing of roles, this ever-changing of roles in the data center, in application developers. The administrator roles, we'll talk a little bit about those. The developers and what happens to developers and how the people who they touch really change. And then to the business owner, the application owner, and how they get to talk and deal with this new change of the infrastructure and change that's occurring pretty much in real time around the world. So there's an interesting discussion then about what makes a good cloud customer. We know that the skill sets are going to change, and we're getting some pretty good feedback from companies deploying both public and private clouds or hybrid clouds about their expectations of being a customer. So this is not about the infrastructure. There's a lot of discussion we can have about the infrastructure. But what we find is the single biggest impact today is actually at the people and process level, but not necessarily for technology. And the things that we're seeing or being asked to provide, as us as a cloud provider, or in fact anybody else as a cloud provider, is transparency. Transparency about what's going right and transparency about what's going wrong, and the immediacy of being able to deal with that and being able to communicate with that. And so we spend quite a lot of time talking to customers around the world, really trying to understand what this is, and from a services perspective, trying to work with those customers, helping them transform their organizations at the same time as they land up transferring their technology. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen this kind of diagram that shows the I/O maturity models that we've had. We've been talking about this for a long time, but there's an interesting underlying impact of these I/O maturity models, as they're called. There were some great studies that were done by my friend Eduardo in the audience that looked at the impacts of moving up this stack. And the data that comes out of this is actually pretty interesting. If you look at Exchange, for example, when you're basic on Exchange, we generally found that you have downtime of about 9.5 hours, and if you move up that stack in the richness of what you do, you can actually reduce that to less than an hour. And then the other one line is about SharePoint, where the cost to run SharePoint in BASIC is about $23,000. The cost to run SharePoint when you move up the stack, you can take it down to $1,200 a year. When you look at this data, you'd say, well, why doesn't everybody do this? The advantages of going up the stack are really compelling. Why is this not happening? And it turns out that in order to move up that level of maturity, there's a lot of work that needs to be done around technology, but more interestingly enough, around people and process and automation that allows you to get to that level of maturity. So what we find in the marketplace today, when you do an audit, is that around 80 to 85% of our installed base still sits in BASIC. There's some more people who are moving up that stack and almost none who sit in Dynamic. And so we know there are incredible advantages, both cost and time advantages, TCO advantage of moving up the stack, but it turns out that it's pretty hard to do. And so for me, the simplest way of thinking about this, frankly, is that moving to a cloud structure, whether you're private cloud or public cloud or whatever, is really leapfrogging to Dynamic. It turns out that it is the easiest way of taking what you've got today and leapfrogging to all of those benefits at the top of the stack of rationalized and Dynamic. And what you're doing is you're actually then moving up to a cloud-like topology when you do that. So one thing I need to clarify as we go through this thing is the difference between a service and a cloud. Just because something is a service doesn't mean that it's cloudable. It just means that it's a service. In fact, we've had service topologies and service architectures, service-based architectures for a long time. There are SOA-based applications that have been built for a long time. Many applications are built with a WS star kind of interface, but that doesn't make them a cloud. It doesn't make them a cloud. And so what constitutes a cloud is really an interesting question. It's really, in my mind, it's about a series of automation engines that takes things that a good operator could do today, but things that are not necessarily repeatable by others, and automates those to make them occur safely. And that a cloud does not, virtualization does not make it a cloud. Virtualization just means you're doing some interesting work and maybe consolidation. But just because something is virtualized doesn't mean that it is cloudable, as well as the being manageable and some other abilities. And so when we look at the impact between these two things, the difference between a service and the difference between a cloud, let's try and get a little bit more clarity on that, looking at two quick stacks. The first stack is a technology stack, starting off with the hardware and going up to the application. You'll see this breakdown, this taxonomy from us as sort of a regular communication vehicle. And then I made up another stack on the other side. I really did make it up. It kind of is the same size, and that's how it balanced. But in that list are a series of automation engines that can be applied in the cloud. Started off with provisioning, when you actually provision the original cloud, migration, how you move things around, load balancing that occurs dynamically, elasticity, resiliency, quotas, commerce engines, all the way up through that stack. And we can actually build varying levels of automation of each one of those elements. So in fact, what happens is that at any point in time, your infrastructure today is sitting at some intersection point on this two-dimensional matrix. And as you try and move up the maturity grid, what you're doing is actually trying to navigate from where you are into that top right-hand corner of that particular picture. A little more complicated than that, which is each one of those automation engine types actually has its own maturity model that actually has various depths of maturity. And so in reality, we're sitting in a cube. And in the Rubik's Cube, you're actually placing yourself in the cube and again, trying to move yourself over a period of time into that top right-hand quadrant, into that top right-hand corner of this cube. And the question is, which one of these automation engines do you need in your cloud? If you're running a private cloud, do you really need it to be elastic? Not necessarily. Do you need it to be resilient? Well, maybe I need to have reliability in the database service, but not necessarily in some others. And so we'll spend some time looking at that. Let me quickly go through some scenarios, and then we'll move to the demos. We spend a lot of time talking to customers around the world who are trying to deploy clouds today, private clouds, this is, And it comes up that there are 6 canonical types. The first one is, give me everything new. I want a new infrastructure that's positioned as infrastructure in a service, and on top of that, I want to run various workloads as software as a service, projecting them out to my user. There's some of these, but the reality is the installed base wins and not that many. The next one is then taking an existing infrastructure that you've got, and then taking a workload, a business productivity workload like Exchange or SharePoint, and making that available internally inside of your company as a service that you're projecting to users. And then there's a variant of that, which is to layer on top of that a VDI interface, as Robert talked earlier, as one of his examples from HSBC, that's put VDI on top. We see many customers doing this as well, and this is one of the things we've been asked to produce today. When you then look at hosters and governments and enterprises that are projecting out as IT as a service to their own businesses, 3 variants of that. The first one is completely segmented by customer type. So for a hoster, customer 1, customer 2, customer 3, each one of these stacks could be inside of a rack where there's a decoupled infrastructure as a service, software as a service put out to users. The next step is to then build out a common infrastructure as a service, and finally build out a common multi-tenanted, hostable, elastic, fully automated business productivity as a service. This is hard to do. The team that's building Office 365 is the one that's building this. And this is complicated, and we have thousands of engineers to do this. So although many customers are really asking for this, we'll go back and question them and say, do you really need elasticity on your internal cloud or not? And so there's some clarity that we're going to hope to clear up this morning as we go do some things. So first thing they want to do is, if that's the way private clouds are put together, let's show you a little more detail from one of the demos you saw earlier about how you actually can do that. So I'd like to have Kenan come up, and we're going to go through and actually show you how to build a private cloud. Hi, Kenan. Thanks for coming up.
Thanks, Norm.
E would be there. There you go.
Good morning, everyone. For you IT pros out there, how many times have you been ready to go home on a Friday night, and the app guy comes in and says, hey, I want to deploy a brand new service. I want to have this much CPU. I need this much storage and networking.
And I want it on Monday morning.
No, he wants it Friday or Saturday, right?
Yeah.
What do you have to do that? You have to go and make sure you have all the resources available. If not, you got to provision them. Then you got to go talk to the storage guys, and they probably already left at noon, so you're never going to find them until next week. The networking guys, you got to go and get the IP addresses that you need. I mean, there's all these different pieces that you have to put together. What if you could put all that together in one tool and have that private cloud and build that private cloud more quickly so you can be more responsive to your end users? That's what we're trying to build and deliver with System Center 2012.
Cool.
What I'm going to show you here today is that within System Center 2012, we have Virtual Machine Manager. And Virtual Machine Manager allows me now not only to manage just the virtual machines, but all the infrastructure underneath that you would provide to create the cloud. So
would be like networking and storage and...
Exactly. So it's your underlying physical fabric, your networking, your storage, your compute, whether that hypervisor is running on Hyper-V, VMware, or even Citrix XenServer. We support now all 3 of those major hypervisors. So I have here the view of the cloud environments. I can create clouds and place them on top of these different pieces of infrastructure which I've concatenated together.
So you're binding a logical cloud to physical plumbing.
Exactly. And that physical plumbing can be multiple different heterogeneous hardware that I've lumped together. And within this clouds, I can assign and create services and deploy them to each of these different individuals. I can set quotas. So if we look at this dev test cloud right here, I can set a quota on this cloud that allows me to limit how much of the resources this cloud takes. This gives me some protection so that I can control my underlying physical infrastructure while I give the business unit or the app owner the freedom to deploy as many services as he can fit in that
quota system
that I've deployed to him. But what I do is I've also be able to manage the underlying physical hardware. This is new with VMM 2012 in that I can manage the storage devices. If I have storage devices like from NetApp or EMC, HP, Hitachi, and they have this SMIS provider, I can attach that to VMM, and I can deploy LUNs when I need to, which means that I don't have to wait for that storage guy to give me that LUN to access to store to my machines. I can just deploy it out and attach it to my Hyper-V servers. I have the network abstraction layer where I don't want this app guy to say which physical adapter which talks to the network and what VLAN. I can figure all that myself, and then I can create this logical abstraction and say, if you're accessing the Corp network, I'll figure out which physical adapters it touches. And then lastly, I can manage the servers. And these servers can be all over the place. They don't have to be just in one data center, which means that if I go to, say, my Atlanta host group here, I have servers, and these servers are from different hypervisors. In other words, this conprod cluster, that's an ESX DRS cluster. I have that enabled. So we support now vSphere 4.1 with VMM 2012, so you can bring those in and leverage them right alongside my Hyper-V clusters. So I have both types of clusters within within VMM at the same time, and when I deploy a service, it'll deploy to the best hypervisor for that application or service. So what I can do is I can basically just take a machine, and in the fabric layer, I can manage and deploy a physical server. I can take a bare metal server that's plugged into a rack, and I can deploy a brand new OS on it, reboot it, join it to VMM, and then I can create a cloud and put it on top of that.
Wow.
So what I'll do right now is I'll show you exactly how I can do that. So within VMM, I can take this cloud services, and I can deploy a brand new resource on the cloud. So I'm going to add a new Hyper-V host, bare metal deployment, go through, deploy the OS to that system, then I'll go out, create a brand new cloud, and deploy it onto that new cloud resources that I created.
And how long is this going to take you?
It'll take me 2 minutes.
2 minutes. All right.
Ready?
You ready?
Ready.
Go.
Okay, so first of all, I need to say what kind of host it is, and that's going to be a physical host. We are connecting to the baseboard management account, which in this case is an HP server, so it's an ILO system. We use the standard protocols like IPMI to talk to that ILO system and tell it to reboot the system. Now what I need to do is tell it where that server is, and it's within this range right here. If I type well. What it's going to do now is it's going to actually go out and pull the different servers that are out there, find the different servers and ILO accounts that are there, and then I'll be able to choose the one that I want to deploy this service to. It takes about 10 or 15 seconds to check all the different
So it's actually
IP
walking
addresses.
through right now.
It's walking through all those different 10 IP addresses in that range. And what we're going to see is that I have a few servers in there, and this is the one that I just put in that's a brand new server. I'm going to tell it where to put it, and I'm going to do it in Atlanta. And it's asked me which VHD file. So we're going to deploy a Hyper-V VHD file on it and give it a name.
There's a minute.
And just put in the MAC address. And at this point, now it's going to reboot that machine and start deploying the OS on it. If we look in the fabric under all hosts in Atlanta, we see now con HSV 444 is there. But that's just half of it. Now I got to deploy a new cloud for that business unit that asked me. So here, let's create a new cloud. And it was Norm that asked me, so I'll say Norm's cloud. Next.
I've always
And
wanted
then
my own cloud.
we'll choose Atlanta. You can deploy all the services you want. We'll give him access to the corporate network. He needs a load balancer because he's obviously going to be using major applications that need to use some round robin. You want high performance or low performance, Sam?
Low.
Low? Okay, great. And then from there, I'm going to limit you, though, to only 10 virtual machines because I don't want you using up all my resources. And then I can pick the different hypervisors here. If I want to ESX or Zen, I can choose it. And at that point, I'm done. I've created a cloud. Now he has access. He can go and deploy new services to this cloud on that new server and machine when I've expanded the resources for him.
1 minute and 58 seconds.
Awesome.
How long would that take you to do today, to actually go out and do that?
Thank you.
Great. Thanks. So as you can see, there's some pretty real stuff that you can do, and given some of the stuff that you're seeing here in 2010 in System Center, it really is going to make the notion of clouds and private clouds and how to deploy them much simpler. But one of the most important things about a cloud, it's about the workload. You're just having a cloud that does nothing is actually not that useful because you can log into the cloud and not much else. And so the next best thing that we need to talk about is, so what do you do with the workloads? What do you do in terms of deploying something onto that cloud? How do you build something that's really useful that you start to see? So the next thing that we're going to do is talk to you a little bit more about Azure, but more interestingly enough, about App Fabric. App Fabric is providing a very rich set of APIs today, and the good news is it actually gets richer. So starting today, available for download, is a new CTP from Azure App Fabric. And the thing that it has into it that's really amazing, there's some new scenarios that are there, but there's really some incredible stuff that's being added around how to build some event-driven applications using some new technology that we brought in. So what I'd like to do is to show you that rather than just talking about it. So I'd like to invite Clemens up, who's going to give us a real-time demo, and hopefully some of you have actually loaded the little application that we talked about earlier.
Yes.
Hey, Clemens, thanks for coming up.
Thank you. So, you switched it already for me. That's very nice. Thank you.
Hey.
Wonderful. So what we're going to show you is a little example or scenario here. And let's set that up for a moment. We have some retail points of sale. We have real-time analytics. We have business operations and marketing. We have inventory and fulfillment centers. And what that is for is we want to track a radio and TV marketing campaign. We want to track that in real time. So someone who's making a product is starting this campaign. Now they are interested in what the impact of that TV and radio campaign is in real time over the course of an hourly basis or even.
So this is at retail. We've done the radio campaign, and we're trying to look at what's happening in retail in real time.
That's right.
Okay.
So one of the things that is really difficult here in terms of how to set up an application that accomplishes this is you have retail points of sale which are not yours, which are you probably have franchise stores. And then you have business operations and marketing, which need to have real-time insight. You also need to have your inventory replenished, obviously, if your product is doing well. So typically and traditionally, you would put a big database app in the middle and have that all done. If you're a little more sophisticated.
And it would be batch-oriented.
Likely. Yeah. So if it's batch-oriented, another thing you could do is you could build this in a messaging way. Right. So you could have a messaging infrastructure that sits somewhere. But then you still have the issue of having to federate access control, and you still have the issue that you have to put that messaging infrastructure somewhere. And so what we've done is, and this is what we're announcing today, is we're putting a full-blown publish, subscribe, and queuing infrastructure inside of Windows Azure App Fabric Service Bus. So the first thing we'll have is a reliable queuing infrastructure that you can access from anywhere where you can see the internet. So if you have applications that need to use a queue, you can sign up for Windows Azure App Fabric, create a Service Bus namespace, and create a queue inside that namespace, and you can publish to that queue, and you can queue messages from that queue, and that's a queuing infrastructure you can use from anywhere. So in our scenario, we're hooking up the stores to that inventory. That's the first step, so that the queues can report in real time what the inventory flow is, and that's how we're decoupling this. Why do we need to decouple? If the product really does well, we don't want to overload the inventory at the back end with all that traffic from the front end. Right? It may be physical stores. It may also be stores that are on the internet. And if the product is really popular, you want to insulate them. So putting a queue in the middle, putting that infrastructure in the middle, gives you a really nice insulation from that spiky traffic. What it also gives you is a nice way with competitive consumers on the receiving end to create load balancing. As the queue is accumulating more load, as the queue length rises, you can add more workers, or you could even go and fan out work across different sites. Then you can also, and that's another new capability, not use a queue, but rather use a topic. So we have a brand new PubSub capability called Topics. And with these topics, you can go and publish data into a topic, and then you can have many subscriptions that are hooking up to that topic. I'm going to show you some examples of that. And the first example, the obvious one, is if you are accepting messages into a workflow like this inventory management, what you want to do is you want to capture the original data that's flowing in, so you can have an audit tab on that data. So with the new topic capabilities that we're presenting in Service Bus, you can do that. You can have a mainline subscription that basically puts it all into the inventory, and you have the same capabilities that you have on the queue. So on the queue, you can still load balance, you can still have many publishers into that topic, but now you can add tabs on that same event stream, and each tab gets a copy. So we have
It gets a full copy. So in this case, both audit and inventory get a full and complete copy, even though they may be pulling it off asynchronously.
That's correct.
Okay.
And then you can also add another subscription. You can add additional subscriptions, for instance, for a dashboard. So there's a website. There is a website. If you want, you can actually do that right now. You can be a point of sale, and you can go to www.martview.net, and you could go and download a little app if you wanted to do that. So that will go, you can go and sign up, and that will take you with your preferred account. We don't require any passwords here.
So you've got federated ID here.
It's federated identity, so I can go and sign up with my real Facebook account. It goes, sends me back, it already knows about me, and I can download the application. I already have that application running, and I'm going to show you that in a moment. There it is. So I'm not going to reinstall that.
This is the point of sale terminal.
That's the point of sale terminal. So if you download this, you're going to get this, and then you can go and buy and purchase goods. And the way this is going to show up is, see, there's people who are participating. That's very nice. Thank you very much. So we're now seeing the real-time flow of data, and the way this is done through this topic infrastructure, how we're tapping into that flow. What we can then also do is add additional tabs. We can, for instance, go and do some analysis. So MartView, the company that we're, fictitious company that we're representing here, is running a data analyzer. So what they do is they have a solution that they run, and that's using Microsoft SQL Server Stream Insight. And so they're subscribing into this, from this topic into a Stream Insight query engine, and they're republishing events. And so they're doing roll-ups of that data and are republishing that. And then we're also feeding that into the dashboard. So in the dashboard, I can see statistics flowing. And as you guys are adding more...
Suddenly that's peaking.
Yes, we're actually getting more data as it flows in. We're doing pretty well in sales, as you can tell.
We're selling lots of rocks, but
yes.
less paper.
Well, rocks seem to be very popular, so that's a wonderful thing. So now as you see here, we have labeled our machines. So there's a bunch of machines that are sitting in Redmond. And all the new machines, look at how many people are participating. That's fantastic. We have a lot of people who are participating from Atlanta. So what we can also do here is we can go and apply some filters. Right now, we're looking at all the traffic. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go and reset this and say, now we only want to see the traffic from Atlanta. What the topic infrastructure also has is the ability to go and filter on that event stream that you're getting. And you can create filter expression using simple SQL92 syntax that will allow you to go and filter those events down. So if we go...
So does that filter to all subscribers or to only one?
That filters one subscription, but everybody who hangs on that subscription now gets it. And you can have a subscription update the rules on the fly. So what we're seeing now is only the things that are happening from Atlanta. And I'm at Atlanta too, so if I go and purchase something, then that should show up in a moment. That's me. So now we have the same kind of stream, but we have applied a filter, so we get that data all filtered in this way, which is, see, more people are showing up, more people are buying things, so that's a wonderful thing that's happening here. And then lastly, what we can also do, and that's something that is a real problem in many places, is real-time product and pricing updates.
So this is pushing back now.
Yeah, so this is pushing back now. So what we can do is now we can go and say, hey, there's more goods that we can buy. So what I'll do is I'll go back into my dashboard, into products, and let's go and show the other one too. And so I'm going to add a new product. I'm going to add a cloud that you can also buy.
Buy a cloud. There you go.
Buy a cloud and submit. That cloud now shows up for me, and it also showed up for everybody who's running an app now. So we now not only did fan in, but we also did fan out. So we can go and look at those machines and see whether people are already buying clouds. Right? I just bought a cloud. And that should show up. That showed up. And other people on the outside also bought cloud, so that's apparently working. So we now basically did a fan in of all that data, and we did a fan out of information to connected devices which are just sitting in this room. So we're just using this network. We didn't change it in any way.
You don't know how many point of sales are out there. You just add it and it projects out.
It projects out and does that.
Which means that the point of sale is sending to one single place and receiving from one without necessarily the understanding of what's in the other
Correct.
side.
And that's the publish, subscribe capabilities and the queuing capabilities that we have. Tomorrow at 3, I have a session in room C208 where I'm showing all the details of that and the code behind it.
So one quick question, though, which is that if I can have lots of people sending, what do I do about denial of service in this case? Because in theory, I could write an app that's going to just spew stuff at you. How do we deal with that?
That's right. So you were secured with an overlay of the access control service. So to send to our queue, you need to have a valid token from that service. And so denial of service attacks and all those things are things that we handle in the cloud. So if someone
you filter it before it even comes in?
We just filter it before all that traffic comes into that messaging infrastructure.
Wow, pretty powerful. Cool. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for your participation. So one more thing we want to add is, but wait, there's more. So there's a CTP that's available today, I guess, for App Fabric. There's going to be another one that's going to be available in June that's going to have a couple more pieces on it. It's going to have some things about application management. There's going to be some developer tool integration, and then a composition model, a single composition model that actually gets inherited both to the developer tools as well as the app manager and deployment. This stuff will be available later in June as a sort of second CTP on the follow-up at the one that you can download today. So when we look at applications like the one that you've seen here, I think of them in two ways. Firstly, there's symmetrical applications, which means that the application that's running on-premise is the same that's running in the cloud. And a mailbox is actually the easiest thing to talk about then. Mailboxes are very fungible. In fact, that you really don't know where your mailbox is at any point in time, whether it's running on-premise, running in the cloud, or frankly, whether it's running in a hybrid location. The much more interesting scenario is, in fact, asymmetric clouds, where you have different pieces of code running on-premise and different pieces of code running in the cloud. We see this as the first step that many organizations are taking in what we'll call the burst-out mode, which is I've got an application that's running on-premise, but I somehow want to take advantage of what's going in the cloud. And I'll end up building this asymmetrical model in very interesting ways, and then you'll end up moving functionality around between those environments, much as you would have in a sort of a fairly classical client-server environment. So what we want to do is actually show you what that looks like, and to do that, we're actually going to use a SharePoint frame to do that. So I'd like to invite Steve Fox up, and Steve's going to show us how that is going to work with SharePoint. Hey, Steve, thanks for coming up.
Thanks. All right, let's just make sure we got this set up here. All right, so basically, if you look at the traditional market for SharePoint, it's very enterprise-driven. And so what I wanted to do today was talk a bit about a scenario where what we've got is we have an on-premises instance of SharePoint on the one side, and then we leverage the cloud for things like data querying and things like dropping services so we can work with that data. Now, the scenario against the on-premises and the cloud, basically the complement between SharePoint and the cloud is, in essence, as you can see, you've got all the laptops along the bottom. I'm a portfolio manager for Contoso Oil and Gas, and I need to monitor the daily sales for all the gas stations in my region. But the thing is, we have constant transactions, right? So I don't want to chase hardware internally. I want to let Windows Azure and SQL Azure handle that scalability.
To scale with you.
Yeah, exactly. And so what you're seeing here is essentially all those gas stations have transactions. They're pushing it into SQL Azure. And me as the portfolio manager, I just want visibility into the data. And I'm going to use SharePoint as that visibility portal. So let's jump into my SharePoint experience here. Basically, what we have here is my generic SharePoint site that I look at pretty much every day. You can see I've got some news that's coming in from externally here. I've got some oil news, and if we go down, you can see I've got some press releases. So I can get the complement between, again, that external news and the internal news to help me get some context to get my data
This is
started.
a very typical SharePoint site that most companies would run today.
Yep, and it's branded so it looks and feels like Contoso Oil and Gas. You can see down here I can get today's gas prices depending on the different state. Let me just go down here and filter. You can see that I call this the unicorn widget because you're more likely to see a unicorn than you are to see gas prices at $3 a pop. But the point is, this is some context for my day, and I can get started, and this is great. Now, the thing is about SharePoint, it's built around collaborative features, right? So the thing I want to do is I want to have the ability to basically create documents, and one of those documents I might want to create is a campaign to help a gas station who may not be doing well. And so you can see here, I've got some documents here. I've got a marketing campaign proposal, a form that I would fill out to kick off a business process, all those core features that allow me to collaborate with others inside my organization. You know, you get the Office web apps, which again is another way in which I can build out a campaign. You can see here, this is a simple campaign to target a 10% increase for a particular store. Now the question is, how did I get to this actionable document that I'm then going to hand on to one of my subordinates? What we have here is we have the ability to go into a Silverlight application here, and this is where I get into displaying the data. So for example, I can go here and I can filter out on a particular state, or all the states, and filter on a day. And what happens is I've got that Windows Azure side of my system here working where I issue a query, it goes out and calls that Windows Azure WCF service, which pulls the data from SQL Azure and then populates with a kind of a layer in my Bing map to give me some indication of how well that state is doing at the aggregate
all
level.
of that stuff is in the cloud, but the Bing map is being brought into the SharePoint side.
Exactly. So for the developers in the crowd, this in essence is a Silverlight application in a web part, but it's connected to a WCF service with a query that lives in the cloud. So part of it is on-premise, part of it is in the cloud. And so you can see here with the overlays, we've got some green and we've got some yellow. Thankfully, you don't have too much red. Now the nice thing is I can go back and I can refresh this again. I can show the stores. And what this allows me to do is, again, go out and add another layer on top of that Bing map to get some additional visibility. Here what we can see now is all the different stores in those regions which would accrue to a yellow or accrue to a green or subsequently a red. Now what we can do is let's jump over into Georgia and let's actually drill down, which is great since we're here in Atlanta. I'll drill right down. And that'll actually refresh here. It'll just take a second. And there we go. And it'll refresh to see all the local stores. And again, it'll show the state. And so what we can do is we can then just mouse over for a particular push pin and get some information that's discrete to that particular store. So here we can see that, hey, we're 15% above target. We're yellow. But there again, there could be others where it's red. And the point is, at this point, as a portfolio manager, I can look at this data and say, okay, well, I've got all this data that's coming into my Bing map. I can take the action to create a campaign, which then would take me back to other parts of the SharePoint experience, right? Again, so I'd go back, I create a campaign form, create a document, and so on and so forth that would take me down that path of managing the campaign. So it's pretty interesting stuff that we can do just in taking the on-premises instance of SharePoint today and then kind of extending that out into the cloud.
Now, data is now sitting in SQL Azure and it's being pulled down.
Exactly. And so this is, again, a code-centric solution. But the point is I wanted to build out a demo here that was not only something that would be interesting for devs, but also for IT pros, because we have a fairly mixed audience down the middle here at TechEd. So you can see here, if we go to the right-hand side of my Silverlight application, I've got some reports. Now, these are canned reports that I've built, literally using the Business Intelligence Development Studio, so SQL Server reporting services. This is essentially, again, a direct connection against SQL Azure. Now, we're the Silverlight app called a WCF service that kind of queried the data. What we're doing here is we're basically creating a form that's really written against that SQL Azure data. And what we can do is we can create a number of different forms here. So these are fairly generic forms. We can just pop here.
These are just reports coming out of reporting server.
Exactly. And they're basically deployed into SharePoint. And again, you just walk through a process in the Bid Studio that allows you to go ahead and do that. Again, simple trending for sales, simple trending for sales revenue versus month. And again, we can get some total revenue. Now the point is, we can do this very simply by jumping into Business Intelligence Studio. The real major difference here is if you look here, there's one option for SQL Server at the top, another one for SQL Azure. In essence, it's a different connection string, and it's that simple in terms of the difference between connecting out to the cloud.
So yeah, I've got SharePoint on-premise, I've got reporting services on-premise, and I'm reaching out, and what you just showed is I could either go to local data, or I can go to Azure data, and it's actually just in the connection string, otherwise there's no difference.
Right, right. And so the point is, when we're thinking about our skills, right, and a lot of times people are wrapping their heads around what the cloud actually means. If you're thinking about the skills, it's not this huge leap forward. In the context of SQL Server reporting service, it's pretty much the same process. If you look at the code behind the service, we can see here, just to see this code here, this is the type of stuff that we've done today. This is just basically a query that we're running out in the service, and this is just a query string, right? So we're using list collections, classes, things like that. All the stuff that you know today, you can cross-apply to the cloud. So this is not this huge paradigm shift for developers. This is cross-applying the things you already know.
Wow.
So with that, I think the last thing I wanted to show you here was if we go back to the stats site, this is just another thing where we have some web parts that, again, providing me with some insight into what's going on out in the cloud, pulling cloud data via that service, via web part, and I can go and take a look at the top 10 stores or the bottom 10 stores. And again, there's some action there.
These are standard reporting functions?
These are actually custom web parts
Custom
here.
parts.
Yeah, so
Okay.
this would be code that you would write. But again, it's written against that service that lives out in the
That same
cloud.
service, right.
Yeah, and then of course we have another little widget
Little
here
graph
that we can
widget.
do. Now the nice thing is I can literally, if we think about portability as a kind of a second part to this, if we look at this particular application here, this is a Silverlight application, ties into a service deployed into the cloud and data deployed into the cloud. I could take this and literally, as in its current form, push it into SharePoint Online. So it works not only with SharePoint on premises, but it also works with SharePoint Online and Office 365. So there are ways to design your applications so the symmetry...
So the parts can move around.
Exactly. And then, of course, just as a final thought, in terms of SQL Server reporting services,
Yep.
we have that CTP out now where you can actually take these reports that I showed you before and build those against SQL Azure and have them live in SharePoint Online. It's a CTP. You can get more information at Microsoft.com, whack Windows Azure, whack SQL Azure, whack reporting.
Got that one.
I had to write that down. But the point is you can get some more information there about the CTP and get involved in that.
But I think you're going to see more and more of that symmetry on what we're doing, which is if you run the stuff locally and you're happy with it, you can actually move that and sort of relocate that functionality into the cloud without losing any fidelity of the application, without any different code.
Yep.
Cool.
All right. Thanks,
Thank
Norm.
you. So starting to get to more about the applications and how we can start to move those around, there's an interesting aspect, I think, around SQL Azure, and I get this question all the time, so I wanted to spend a second on it, which is SQL Azure is a full-blown SQL Server database. There's still some services that we need to put in there, but what does this mean to the DBA? And so when you talk to many DBAs today, if you had building a database 15 years ago, remember the database engine actually owned the disk drives, didn't give it to the operating system. And then a good DBA lays out the table space. They put a particular table on a particular drive to make sure you're optimizing performance, take the schema, denormalize the schema, build the queries, build the indexes to get a great application. Well, what happens in SQL Azure is that you don't know, there's no construct of disk drive. There's a construct of a data space. And so you get that basic data space, but as a DBA, you still have to lay out the tables, denormalize the schema, build queries, and build indexes. So what's happened is that the infrastructure's just got a little bit deeper. It's got a little bit in terms of virtualizing some of those capabilities and abstracting out, in this case, storage. But you still need DBAs, and they still have to do things, because otherwise you just build a bad elastic database. So there's some stuff around SQL Azure that we're going to announce today as well, which is some things that are going to happen later this summer in an update. The biggest thing is around management and taking snapshots and backup and auditing to allow you to better control the state of your database and ease migrations backwards and forwards in the cloud, including some management pieces. And then we just saw Stream Insight, which is an engine that runs on your premise that actually, if you don't know what Stream Insight is, you need to go to some sessions on it, because it's an amazing engine that looks at data streams and actually analyzes them in real time. What's as part of this announcement later on is in fact this ability where through this project code named Austin, which is that Stream Insight will run as a service with SQL Azure in the cloud. So not only will you be able to run it on premise, but you'll be able to run it in the cloud in some pretty interesting ways. One thing I want to say about SQL Server and SQL Azure, each one of you probably got this poster when you came in. There's some amazing stuff in here that'll teach you about SQL Server. One of the things that I really like is how to build SQL Server for a private cloud, and some things that you can do, especially about how you configure and install and manage and update it, that allows SQL Server to be a great database when you're running in a private cloud. Another topic I just want to talk about quickly when we talk particularly around these hybrid applications is who owns the running application. Now when you're running an application on premise, it could be mail, but it could be a sophisticated application. Today, you actually know that you own that application. You have to manage it, you have to own it, you have to support it, and do all those good things with it. What happens when you take that application, as we just saw, and you moved it into Azure or into, in fact, any cloud? Who owns that running application? We own the infrastructure, and we'll give you a service level with the infrastructure, but your application that's running in the cloud, you actually own it. You still own that running application. You own the responsibility of making sure that it's running reliably, that it's instrumented in the appropriate ways. And so there actually is, we did an acquisition back in October of a product called AviCode. And if you don't know about AviCode, you really need to go look at it, both on the IT side as well as the dev side. It's a set of instrumentation classes that you can embed into your application so that your application becomes well instrumented from the beginning. And those events actually then flow back into System Center. And it'll work both if your application is just running, you have an ASP.NET application running locally, or more interestingly, if you have an application that's running in Azure in the cloud. There's another thing about Azure that I want to point out, which is you still have an obligation to write secure code. Just because you're running in a cloud as opposed to your own internet site doesn't mean that you have to forget about security. So everything that you know about the tools and techniques for writing secure code is still incredibly important. Because if you don't do that, all that'll happen is you'll get an elastic virus. That's the advantage of running in the cloud. You get resiliency and elasticity. And in many cases, the only time you'll find out about this virus is when you get your bill at the end of the month and suddenly it's gone up and you don't know why. So when you think about writing in the cloud, in this sense, nothing is for free. You still have to write great code. You still have to write secure code. You still got to be thinking about threat models and the impact of that on your code. And do that, you'll have great applications. Don't do it, and you're setting yourself up for some potential problems. So what we want to show you is how can you take a current application that's running on-premise, that's a pretty complex app that has lots of moving parts, and move that over to the cloud. So I'd like Michael to come up, and if we can switch to Michael. There you go. We're going to show you how to do that. Hi, Mike. Thanks for coming up.
Hey, thank you, Norm. Hello, I'm Michael Washam, and in this demonstration, I'm going to walk through taking an existing ASP.NET application and extending it out to the public cloud with Windows Azure. So just to set the stage, the company we're moving is Woodgrove Bank, and their business is growing rapidly, but their website's just not keeping up with the increased demand. So what they want to do is they're moving their web app out to Azure to address their scalability concerns.
Good choice.
Exactly. So the primary functionality of their website allows a customer to enter some personal information. They don't have a cheat button, of course, and they can actually get a mortgage quote live on the internet. So just a little technical background of how this all works behind the scenes is personal information was actually stored in process with ASP.NET in proc session state. The mortgage quote is actually generated from a rules engine that's written in native code, pure Windows service. And we have one more piece of functionality, the Save My Quote button, that actually generates a PDF file for the customer to save to their desktop or print for whatever they need to do with it. So that's actually implemented by a third party. And that
So I don't have source for that. I've just got the running file.
Right.
Okay.
They just have a product. They don't have any source code for it. So I'm going to open up Visual Studio, and if you're an IT pro, you'll just have to bear with me. And we're going to create a package where we take this solution and move it out to the cloud. So as you can see, I have a ASP.NET web project, nothing crazy, just typical ASP.NET code. And I have the Windows service. I do not have the PDS service since we don't actually own the source code for it. To get started, I'm going to go ahead and add a new Windows Azure project to the solution. I'll call it Mortgage Rates. I won't add a role here, but I'm going to go ahead and add a web role project and solution. What I'm doing is I'm taking our existing ASP.NET web project and I'm mapping it to a Windows Azure web role. And all a web role is an instance of Windows Azure designed to run web apps inside of IaaS up in the cloud. So to address the scalability, I'm changing the instance count from 1 to 3, so we immediately go to 3 servers.
I can change this later on.
You can change this out in the cloud. You can change it programmatically any way you need to. And the first thing we want to do is address how we can get this Windows service out to the cloud. So our Windows service, it's pretty fast. It doesn't need a super amount of horsepower, so we're just going to go ahead and deploy it along with the web app. So I'll go ahead and create a folder here that I'm going to add the service and some other files to that we can deploy out. So I'm going to add the rules engine binary, a batch file called startup, and the Visual C++ runtime Redis file that my service actually has a dependency on. Any files that you want to deploy out to the cloud, you have to set a couple of attributes in Visual Studio. You need to set build action equals content and copied output directory equals copy always. So all the batch file does is it actually installs the VC runtime libraries unattended, it installs our service, and it starts the service.
So every time I start up the image, this stuff will run.
Right.
Okay.
So what we need to do to map that, to make our batch file run whenever the web roll is started, is we have to go into the service definition and add a startup or a start task. And a startup task is just some configuration that tells which command line to run and what permissions. In this case, we have to run elevated since we're deploying a service. And task type equals simple tells the web role don't start serving a request until...
It just serializes the instance.
Right.
Cool.
So everything's ready to go. So that takes care of deploying our Windows service out to the cloud. So to address the PDF service, we have another role. Since we don't own the application and the vendor that we purchased it from isn't nice enough to actually give us a unintended setup, they only gave us a wizard. So how we can work around that is we can create a virtual machine image using Hyper-V Manager, Server 2008 R2, install all the patches that we need, install any runtimes, along with our complicated application. We can then take that VHD and upload it out to the cloud. So I already have a VHD that I previously uploaded, has my PDF service running on it. So I'm configuring the VM role with that VHD, and I'm going to scale this one out as well with 3 instances. And I do have to do one more thing. So my PDF service is running on port 80. It's a WCF service. So I'm going to go ahead and add an internal endpoint here that listens on port 80.
So it doesn't publish externally.
Right.
Right. Okay.
So the next thing we need to do is address the in-process session state. So we were running on a single server. User comes in, they establish their session, life is good. But we're moving it out to 3 different servers, so we need that session to be distributed across all the instances.
So if I didn't do that, I would have to come back to the same server to get state.
Exactly. We want to be as scalable as we can, and if we lose that server, we want that session still be alive.
There were lots of apps that were written this way.
Yes, there were. Still are. So Windows Azure App Fabric Cache has a distributed cache and a distributed session provider. All that's needed to take advantage of this is to create a namespace in the App Fabric service and configure your web config with the right settings. And the settings are copyable from a portal. I already have a web config that I've added these settings to, so I'm going to go ahead and add to the project. And I'm going to go ahead and build, just make sure I didn't typo anything. Oh, I'm sorry, I do got to make one code change. Since we changed the PDF service to actually run away from the local machine, we need a way to find out where it is. So I have a little piece of code called getRandomServiceIP that randomly returns an IP address of one of the VM role instances.
So it load balances amongst those 3 instances.
Right.
Okay.
So I'm updating my calling code to use that, and now I'll build. So once a project is built, how you actually get the package created out to the cloud is through the publish option. You have 2 options. You can deploy directly to the cloud, or you can actually create a service package only and hand it off to an IT pro to deploy.
To manage production.
Right. Deploying it through Azure is great for staging and development. Production is usually going to be through other tools such as Kinsero, PowerShell, or uploading directly to the portal. So I already have an application that I previously uploaded. So you can see it's the same application. It's a mortgage rates demo. It has 2 instances or 2 role types, the VM role and the mortgage rates web project. So I have 3 instances in each deployment. I can go quickly bring this up in the browser, and you can see from the URL, maybe, that we're mortgageratesservicesvm.cloudapp.net. So this is live out in the cloud. I can go through the same process. Cheat button still intact. A little slower because I haven't warmed it up. And we still get our PDF file.
Still get the PDF generated back. Wow.
So the end result, we took a ASP.NET application that wasn't exactly designed to be scalable. We moved it to the cloud and gave it elasticity. So, if Woodgrove Bank's business increases, we can scale it out on demand. Or if it decreases, say in the slow season, we can actually scale it back, and Woodgrove's only paying for the capacity that they're actually using.
So we didn't change any of the application code, mix of...
Little tiny bit of code,
Yeah.
Mostly config and deployment changes.
Yeah. And then all these different types, XE types and whatever else, all mixed up in a very simple way. I think the magic of this is actually in that session state, which is App Fabric just sits in the middle and suddenly says, hey, I'll handle session. You think you own it, but actually I do, and everything works.
Exactly.
Some amazing stuff in App. So App Fabric's pretty rich. We saw some stuff earlier on eventing. Yep. This is on session state. It's really going to add another layer of richness in between there.
Exactly.
Cool. Great.
Hey, thank you, Norm.
Thank you. We saw 4 demos. As we said, but sort of taking them from the top end. We talked about what a cloud is. Cloud is a container, and we showed you in 1 minute and 58 seconds how you could actually build that container, make it available to, and then publish its availability and start to drop applications in it. We then looked at some of the amazing stuff that's happened in App Fabric. We saw two interesting things in App Fabric here, which is how to create this new eventing model, create new eventing applications that gives you a slightly different architecture. But interestingly enough, we saw some things there that were really about the hybrid environment. I love the SharePoint application because it takes SharePoint, and I'm sure all of you has at least a dozen SharePoints lying around, if not more. Takes something that's in SharePoint today and starts to use it as a portal to bring in disparate data from all over the place and start to project that, whether that data is coming locally or from the cloud. To the consumers of the data, it's completely transparent. The only difference is that connection string. And then finally, how you can take some of the stuff that you've got today and how you can migrate that stuff pretty much in a fairly simple way, even with complex code types, and start to move that to the cloud and take advantage of the elasticity of the cloud today. And not only elasticity, but you're going to get the resiliency and the availability, as well as reduce some of your IT operating costs as you move that up into the cloud. A couple of reference points for you. We have this Microsoft Virtual Academy. Enroll in it today. It's a great way for you to get content from us, to get readiness from us in a completely virtual way. There's lots of related content from this keynote. They're available into the deck that run through the days that we're here. There's a bunch of resources available. Please fill out your evals because you'll get a big prize if you don't, or if you do. Hope you've enjoyed it. We've tried to cover the whole breadth from the infrastructure to the application and really show you what is real about the cloud, whether it's a private cloud or a public cloud. And one of the interesting things that we see on applications of these types, as you can see from these demos, is the applications are starting to swing to real-time data. It's starting to swing to a way where you can start to deal with real-time data, whether it's a point-of-sale data, a gas station, using technologies like Stream Insight or the App Fabric. You can change the kinds of applications that you're building. You can go from the kinds of applications that you have today into applications that are actually giving your users, your consumers, more intelligence about their business and really start to leverage the power of what's available today to really get to some amazing points. Thank you very much.